And I was asked to talk very broadly about populism and the major changes that we're seeing in politics in Europe at the moment. So I'm going to talk about open societies and open minds. And I'm going to do some analysis of what's going on, how is politics changing, but then I also want to get to remedies, and in particular how Quakers and those who understand the history of Quakerism can come to those remedies themselves. This is a complex issue, but it's also one that's actually not so new as it might look. So I work for the Open Society Foundations, which, as Ron was just saying, were founded by George Soros, actually in the 1980s. In fact, he began first by giving scholarships to black students in South Africa who couldn't study at university in their own country to study abroad in the 1970s. And then he started funding independent underground press at that time in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia in the 1990s. And then he became a major supporter of post-communist transition from the late 1980s onwards. And most of OSF's work throughout the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s was really about post-communist transition in Central and Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, also in the Balkans, and then of course the post-war reconstruction in the early 2000s. Now Open Society Foundations work in about 100 countries around the world, including in Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia. And it's quite a loose agenda, because what is an open society? The foundations and George Soros himself have taken their inspiration from Karl Popper, a philosopher with whom George Soros studied in London, at the London School of Economics, in the 1940s and 50s. And Karl Popper defines the open society in his famous work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, in several ways. But I'm just going to draw out two of the definitions which are really relevant to politics today. One is what he said here. He says, the open society is one in which men, and I would argue women, have learned to be to some extent critical of taboos and to base decisions on the authority of their own intelligence. He also defined the open society as one in which no one person has a monopoly on the truth. There is no monopoly on the truth, that we all come to our own conclusions about things, and this is of course a key to ensuring that there is pluralism in a democracy. It's pluralism that defines democracy, and which makes sure that there is no one ideology. And of course he was writing this during the war, at a moment in European history when totalitarianism had brought ideology to the fore in politics. And so his argument was very much that it's about being critical and also ensuring that you use your own intelligence, your own views, critical thinking, essentially, to preserve democracy. So what's happening now? And I'll come back to this element of critical thinking, because I think it's really key to understanding both what's happening in politics and also what can be done about it. Well, there are some really major changes going on, and I would argue that populism is a symptom as much as it is a cause of political change, because what we're seeing is a major restructuring of politics. And for most of the 20th century, certainly since the labour movements got going at the end of the 19th century, politics has been structured, certainly in Europe and in many other places around the world, on a left-right, sort of, you could call it a vertical axis. And left and right, which of course is a terminology that began with after the French Revolution in the first French Parliament in the 1790s. But it came to be quite familiar to most of us. It was a large-scale structuring of politics and also of society between those who owned capital and had a more conservative mindset and those who were primarily earning money by the labour of their own hands, as Karl Marx put it, and who were primarily the working classes, as they were called. But there are plenty of ways in which you can talk about how left and right has already been disrupted and changed by the growth of, for example, green politics, the environmental movement, also by liberals. There are plenty of other ways of talking about it. But that was the rough structuring. But what we see with the emergence of populism is much more of a structuring of politics, which is about above and below. So instead of left and right, it's about above and below. And the reason why above and below has become so prominent in our political discourse at the moment is because of the main claims of populism, which is that politics should be about above and below. So I'll give you a rather seminal definition which is used by many political scientists in understanding populism from Cas Mudde, who's a Dutch political scientist and who studied populism for a very long time. This is the most often quoted. He says, populism considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups. Though there's the pure people, that's the below part, versus the corrupt elite, that's the above part. And populism argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. So if you think about, for example, in the discourse in the UK following Brexit, the will of the people is cited over and over again as the ultimate truth, the ultimate purpose of politics, which must be obeyed. You also hear this in some of the dialogue of Donald Trump, who talks about the people's will as being a driving force in society. But populism, historically, it comes after all since the 19th century, going forwards, it's easier to understand it if you think of it not so much as an ideology, but as a narrative in search of an enemy. Because in terms of the two antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, you already have an enemy in that definition. You have the corrupt elite. And in arguing that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, you're assuming that the people are a very homogeneous group who all have the same will. You notice that that definition doesn't really leave any space for minorities, for dissenters, for people who think differently about what is best for them and their families. And it takes the people really as a Lumpenproletariat, another term that Marx used, the idea that the general will of the people suits everyone in the society, and that only those, and it's a tautological definition, because only those who join in that general will are the legitimate people of the country. So the general will of the people is what inspires politics, and that general will belongs to the people, but only those who share that general will are the people of the country. So it's a very antagonistic definition of politics. It by definition excludes some people and includes others, and it by definition extends a finger of blame. So this is one finger of blame. I will argue that it actually extends three fingers of blame, but we'll come to that. But the first one is definitely the corrupt elite. So if you think of it as Cas Mudde puts it, not so much an ideology as a narrative in search of an enemy, you can identify a populist really very quickly. Where is the finger of blame pointing? A populist will almost always be looking for an enemy. And here we have three examples of the enemy. So there's a 19th century version, which is the literacy test put by Congress, which aimed to exclude certain immigrants on the basis of their level of education. So that's one exclusionary definition. Another one is in fact a piece of Soviet propaganda which blames a series of different people, but particularly the Jew, you see, is the largest figure there on the right. Various others whom they blame, who are the enemies of the people, and it even says that. And then we have a very recent example of this. So the one on the left is a 19th century one. Then we have a first half of the 20th century one. And then we have a 2016 version. And this is Nigel Farage talking about we must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders. And what he said in unveiling that campaign poster for the Brexit referendum was, the will of the people is against immigration. So here we have the will of the people, and we have a finger of blame. Now, the key elements of populism are that it seeks an enemy, and usually it seeks three different enemies. So one is the enemy above. That's the corrupt elite that was there in the definition. But that's not exclusive to populists. It's not exclusive by any means. Many parties would argue that there is a corrupt elite. In many countries, there is a corrupt elite. So the finger of blame pointing upwards to the government is not serving the people. This is not unique to populism by any means, but it is always there in populism. Typically, a populist will also extend two other fingers of blame. One is to the enemy outside, and the other one is to the enemy within. So the enemy outside, the finger of blame pointing outside, usually finds some figure or some organization which is against the will of the people, or, as I often put it, the national interest. And that, that particular character in the populist drama, if you think of it as a narrative in search of an enemy, that figure can be any one of a range of things. You'll typically hear American populists talking about the UN and its supposed black helicopters, which are here to take away Americans' guns, or going to come in to take away Americans' guns. You'll also hear sometimes it's the IMF. The argument that the IMF is holding countries to ransom. And each of these, there may be elements, typically there are elements of truth and elements of indeed, credible claims mixed in with this, but typically it's an enemy that's outside. Sometimes it's claimed to be the European Union. In Hungary, the Fidesz ruling party did a referendum earlier this year in which they made a series of claims about how the EU is supposedly stopping the Hungarian government from cutting taxes and lowering energy prices. And it very much portrayed the EU as the enemy of the people. There's always an enemy outside. Now they're running a new referendum which is on George Soros being the enemy of the people and the outside enemy, which brings together quite neatly both the EU, which they claim is being directed by Soros, and of course the very familiar enemy that we see here on the right-hand side. Then there's usually an enemy within. And that figure, that sort of, the person who holds that role in the populist drama, can be any number of them. In the 1930s, it was, of course, the Jews. They were typically the enemy within, but also the Roma, people of LGBTI at that point in history, as you know, they were very much persecuted, particularly by the Nazis. But the enemy within is usually somebody who is in the society already. And of course, often it's a minority. And in the film we saw about the Croats in Serbia and the Serbian minority in Croatia, these were the enemy within that was demonized by nationalism in those countries very much in the early 1990s by Milosevic and by Tudjman, respectively. The enemy within is often a minority group. And we see over history the Jews, the Roma, and now increasingly Muslims are targeted in that way. But often it's a national minority. So simply somebody who has a different religion, language, ethnic composition, or other distinguishing feature who is the enemy within. But in addition to this key element of populism of enemies, I would argue another key element of populism is nostalgia. It's the idea that the general population, the people of the country, have lost something because of the enemy within, the enemy without, and the enemy above. But especially the enemy within is somehow taking things that belong to the native people of the country. So in the 1930s, and here you also see it in Soviet propaganda, it's the Jew is taking the money of the people. Often in the case of the former Yugoslavia, the argument made by both Milosevic and Tudjman was that minorities were taking housing that legitimately belonged to majorities, that they had land that should belong to majorities, and they encouraged the origins of the Yugoslav war began in them encouraging people from the majority population to just simply go and take that property. That's how it started. Now, we have a very familiar, another 2016 version of this nostalgia in this particular slogan. Now, what makes this populist? It's not make America great. Lots of politicians say, make our country great. Hillary Clinton said that. You hear this from many politicians. It's the again part that really makes it populist. It's the idea that we were great and we are no longer, and somebody is to blame for that. Who's to blame? Well, as of yesterday, it was Muslims, according to Trump's latest tweets. But the again part suggests that there is something that the majority population, the will of the people, is not achieving that they used to be able to achieve. And that's why so often the 1950s are evoked by populists as an era in which there was more homogeneity in the population, and somehow there was much more of a majority rule. Now, how much that's actually the case is much more questionable, but that is a claim that you will very often hear. Now, what's new in terms of populism in the 21st century that was not there in previous centuries is really two things. One is social media. So the social media are a really, really great medium for populists because they have led to a multiplication of news sources, which means it's actually quite easy to convince people by feeding them seemingly lots of different news sources that any kind of conspiracy theory that you wish to put forward about the enemy above, outside or within is true. So there's no longer just a BBC or an RTL in Belgium or one other public broadcaster which has editors and fact checkers and a research department and which has a public obligation and a board of governors that makes sure that, or are supposed to make sure that it is not biased and it's not issuing false claims and repeating fake news. Now, a public sector broadcaster that has a regulatory framework around it like that is going to be regulating the kind of information that people get. You could argue manipulating it. I mean, that's what a number of state broadcasters have been used for. But in a democracy, a well-regulated state broadcaster is actually an important check on fake news and so on. But when you're getting your news primarily from your Facebook feed, which is the case for, just to take the example of Belgium where we are now, 80% of Belgians under the age of 25 get their news exclusively, nearly exclusively, they say, from their Facebook feed. Then they're getting a combination of many different news sources, but they're also subject to filter bubbles. They're only getting the news that the Facebook algorithm has determined they want to see. So they're not getting a pluralism of views. If we go back to Karl Popper, the idea that you need to hear multiple voices in a society for it to be democratic. They're hearing mostly what they want to hear and people who agree with them. So they're not often exposed to critical thinking. They're not often exposed to people who say different things and give them a multiplicity of information. It may mean they don't get very much information about what's going on in the world if the algorithm has decided that they're not really interested in foreign policy, for example. And social media also tend to fuel a tendency towards conspiracy theory because they give the impression that lots of people who think like you and agree with you are on your side, and those who don't are somehow against you. And there are many very interesting studies about the way that social media have driven and why they drive conspiracy theory. But that I'm just giving you a kind of rough sketch. And to give you a couple of interesting statistics on this is from The Economist. The total Facebook engagements for the top 20 US election stories in 2016, you can see that between February and November, people getting news through their Facebook feed from the mainstream news went down from just over 12% to below 8%. And the fake news that appeared in their Facebook feed, in their news stream, went up dramatically, and in fact became more significant, became more important. So this is really big, and it's moving really fast. This was just last year. I don't know what the figures are for 2017, but I'm not at all convinced that the pale blue line has gone back up again. In terms of conspiracy theory, this again is from the US election last year and from Romney, so Mitt Romney was the challenger in 2012. Respondents' belief in conspiracy theories versus their support for Trump and for Romney. There's a strong correlation between support for Trump and your belief in conspiracy theory. So this is not over time. This is percentage of the vote for Trump and tendency to believe in conspiracy. Whereas those who were interested in voting for Mitt Romney in 2012 tended to have a negative correlation with their tendency to believe in conspiracy theory. So essentially, whatever your views on politics, if you tend to believe in conspiracy theory, you're much more likely to vote for Trump. And then there's misinformation. So this is where the Economist, well, it's Indiana University, did a study of worldwide news articles that people have shared. These are not just the articles that Facebook has put up for people to look at. So the algorithm has determined the news. This is the news they have themselves decided to share with their Facebook friends. And here we see that it's a bit hard to understand because this is again not over time, it's on a log scale, but essentially misinformation has overtaken reliable information in terms of the number of shares. And that was between September 2014 and March 2015, so that was even before the US election campaign. So social media are having a really very fundamental impact on how people see politics and because of the way that they get their information. And that leads to something of an epistemological crisis, which is really driving 21st century populism. We are, in many respects, losing our bearings about what's true and what's false. Now, this again is not new. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche and Immanuel Kant in the 19th and 18th centuries were arguing that, you know, truth is relative, truth is opinion in what Nietzsche said, for example. But relativism has become really extreme. We've gone from Karl Popper saying, well, be careful, listen to multiple voices, don't just believe one person has the truth. We've gone to nobody has the truth. That has also dangers for democracy. We've gone from one extreme to another. So it both means that people, all of us, myself included, are more and more finding it difficult to discern what is true, what is false, what's put out there by, you know, Russian bots, for example, as opposed to what is a verified claim. But it also makes implied connections easier to make, which is great if you want to foment conspiracy theory and if you want to unite different kinds of enemies. So if you think about the migration crisis in Europe in 2015 to 16, so many headlines put together migrants, terrorists, and the European Union in one sentence. The migration crisis was really a perfect storm for populists because it allowed them to bring an enemy from outside, that's the migrants, together with two enemies from inside, the terrorists and the Eurocrats. So the narrative went, and I'm sure you've seen this in various places, that the European Union is helping migrants to come into the EU, or even forcing migrants to come to the EU, if you believe Viktor Orban, who's made this claim, and the migrants are the terrorists. And again, to quote Orban, he said, all terrorists are migrants, it's just a question of when they arrived in the country. So if they have a French passport, the fact that their grandparents or great-grandparents were from North Africa, they're migrants. They're immigrants. So the implied connections are easier to make when it's hard to disentangle truth and falsity. And this matters a great deal because at the moment what we're seeing is still debates within a democratic society, but it's something that can really spread if the population no longer believes in democracy as being about distinguishing for yourself between truth and falsity. And here I would quote Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher of 20th century totalitarianism, who argued that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule, this is the ideal citizen whom the totalitarians can really get hold of, is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. So she's warning us about something that became very important in the 1920s and 30s and allowed totalitarianism to grow at that time. And now we see the way that the populist use of social media can take that to a much greater extreme. And that causes something of a moral crisis, because it changes the incentives for politicians in how they actually talk to citizens and how they engage in politics. When there's constant misinformation, it changes the incentives for individual politicians, because trustworthiness becomes just one option among others for winning elections. So think about Donald Trump. He, I think, even himself cannot believe all of the things that he tweets. But he doesn't need to be trustworthy. He needs to appeal to nostalgia and to claim that the other side would be even more dangerous. Trustworthiness is no longer really critical. I mean, think about Richard Nixon, who was impeached for being found to be lying because of tapes that were released of what he said in the White House because he was proven to have lied. Trump now openly lies, openly even says contradictory things on the same day, certainly over several weeks, because the trustworthiness just doesn't matter as much as it did before. There are other ways of making your mark in politics. One of them is, of course, the politics of fear, to claim that, you know, you might not believe everything I say, but I'm going to protect your interests. And that means that there are disappearing penalties for lies or for false claims. And this is, I think, really dangerous for a democracy, because it makes the epistemological crisis about not being able to tell the difference between truth and falsehood into a moral crisis. So I'm going to finish just by saying a few words about the effects of populism on the European Union, because, after all, we're talking about European affairs and what the EU can do about all of this. And populism has very particular effects on the EU, which are greater than those in national politics. One way of putting it is to say that populism can cause national politics to catch a cold, but the EU gets pneumonia. And that's because it has an effect on both the EU's values and on its working methods. So the EU's values, you may recall, this is Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union from the Maastricht version of 1992. The EU's values are ones which, on which there was a very broad consensus after the Second World War until very recently. Human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights, rights of persons belonging to minorities, and also they are the values of living in a society in which there is pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and gender equality. And it was easy to agree to those in 1992 because there was nobody contesting them. I think it would be very interesting to see whether those words could get through the European Council today, when there are two populist governments, I would argue, actually in the European Council, both the PiS government, the Law and Justice government from Poland, and the Fidesz government from Hungary, who are contesting what exactly these things mean. Whether, for example, equality between men and women is really a key value. That's something that PiS has contested. And the rights of minorities has been contested by Fidesz in arguing that, for example, Hungarians living outside Hungary should have rights which certain minorities in Hungary don't need to have. So there's already contestation of these values going on, and there are many populists who argue that minority rights and equality no longer matter because majorities are the ones who are under threat. That's a classic claim. After all, this is not in line with the thinking that the will of the people, the majority of the country, is the paramount purpose of politics. But in addition to the issue of values, populists also contest very much the EU's working methods. And that's because of the issue of trust and mistrust. So if you think about what those young Croat and Serb minorities were saying in the video that we just saw before, that was a big trust-building project, and they were saying how important trust was. The EU has been a continental-scale trust-building project since 1956, when the coal and steel community was set up. The whole idea behind it was to encourage reconciliation and reduce the propensity to go to war by learning to trust foreigners. Learning to trust people who are not like you, and to do first of all, economic cooperation through coal and steel, the means of production and energy at the time, and to learn to work together in a spirit of compromise and through negotiations. What Jean Monnet called les petits pas de la démocratie, the idea that you work together on small scale, you take small steps on small-scale projects in order to build trust. So the EU is still founded on the idea that it's a trust-building project. But populists fundamentally claim you cannot trust people who are not like you. Politics is about asserting the will of the people, the will of the majority, and you cannot trust people who are from a different tribe, a different community. And that makes an enormous difference in terms of what they say and they claim about the working methods of the EU. So what they frequently do portray negotiations between at EU level being is these are negotiations between elites. They don't necessarily represent the interests of the people. Sometimes that may be true, but these are also, it's a trust building project as well between those elites. They also tend to deride compromise. Donald Trump famously said, "I don't believe in compromise." Only zero-sum outcomes are possible for a populist. They also move the battleground of politics from policy to identity. The EU is all about compromise on policy issues. And the EU is also supposed to be about inclusion. That's the other idea behind it, behind the values of Article 2. And the narrative that the EU has is unity and diversity. We can be diverse, but we have a unity of purpose. Populists claim, on the other hand, that exclusion of enemies is the key the key way of ensuring the interests and the security of the majority population. Now, I've talked about populists in a very broad and general way because I didn't want to get too much into specific parties, but I'm happy to discuss that. But I would just point you to the fact that there are two very different kinds of populists operating in the EU now, and they have different kinds of effects on politics, which we could also come into in questions. But I've nearly spoken for 30 minutes, and really, I think George Bernard Shaw was right, that if you speak for 30 minutes, then you bore yourself, let alone your audience. But I just point you to two kinds of populist party that there are in the EU. There are those who are comfortable on the fringes, taking potshots at politics and only engaging on a quite limited range of policy areas. For example, they only really want to talk about migration. And here I would cite Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, also the Danish People's Party, which got into government very early, one of the first populist parties to come into government, and they only really wanted migration portfolio. That was the only thing that they were concerned about. We're about to see in Austria whether this is also the case of the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, which will be, by the looks of things, a junior partner in the coalition. Will they only go for posts which are about the issues they've campaigned on, like migration, or will they seek other things? But on the whole, they're quite comfortable on the fringes. But then there are also populist parties who want power. And when they get into power, they tend to consolidate their power really very rapidly by taking over state institutions. And this is what's going on in Poland and in Hungary. This is what the big fight about the rule of law is about. It's about whether one party should be able to appoint the whole of the constitutional court, whether one party should be able to take over the state media regulator, whether one party should appoint the rector of every university in the country, as has happened in Hungary. So those are the arguments, and they use different kinds of tactics, but we can come on to that if you want to talk about that. But I would just highlight that there are two different kinds. So finally, what can be done about this? And this is where it's over to you. What do you think should happen? And I would just draw out a few points from Quakerism as I have experienced it that I think are really important antidotes to populism and which make Quakers actually unusually resilient in the face of populist claims and which are, I think, really valuable part of the Quaker tradition and the Quaker way. So first of all, there's think for yourself. So we come back to Karl Popper saying you've got to be able to think, come to your own ideas. I would also refer to George Fox and to Margaret Fell, who both made points about thinking for yourself. There is, of course, discernment, which is incredibly important. To discern the way is to find the truth within yourself, and it's to discern what is really in the interests of the community. And simply the practice of every Sunday morning reflecting, slowing down, going inwards, means you're much less likely to be caught up in a fervour, in a populist fervour of we must impose the will of the people. Simply doing that is a practice which itself, it makes you more resilient to authoritarian tendencies. Also, there's the importance of community. Interaction with the community makes you less likely to see everybody else as your enemy if you're interacting with a diverse group of people within your own community. And of course, there is the many elements of Quaker practice, and I've just included a quotation here from the very end of Quaker Faith and Practice, that Quakerism is not words, but a way. And so, rather than believing in a particular credo, a particular formula of words, it's a way of discernment. Now, all of you will have your own views on this. I simply point to a few factors that seem to me very important and really valuable parts of the Quaker tradition that can provide antidotes to populism. And I just finish with a quotation from George Fox, which symbolises how his view of hierarchy, I think, also applies to sources of information and sources of truth. So George Fox said, "When the Lord sent me forth into the world, he forbade me to put off my hat to any, high or low." And anyone reading the history of Quakerism knows what that led to. It's about oaths, it's about not doffing your cap, which was a very important sign of respect and which many Quakers suffered for their firm belief that they should not be doing that. But I would argue that it forbids you also to put off your hat to any great leader who claims to have the answer and claims that he or she could make their country great again by blaming somebody else either within the country or outside the country. So I leave you with that, and I'm really very interested in what you think about how the Quaker way, the Quaker path, can be a valuable antidote to populism. Thank you.